The subcommittee will come to order. The chair, if you can turn the mic down just a little bit, the chair will recognize himself for an opening statement. One of the great successes in healthcare in the past 30 years has been the introduction and widespread use of generic drugs, saving patients and taxpayers trillions of dollars. Today, nearly 85% of drugs dispensed in the U.S. are generics. This success has been possible because consumers and prescribers have confidence that generic drugs are approved by the FDA as the same as their brand name counterparts, not only in terms of their chemical composition, but also with respect to their safety and effectiveness. This principle of sameness is the backbone of the 1984 Hatch-Waxman Act, which provided the pathway for generic drugs to come to market. A generic product has the same benefits and risk as the brand name drug, and therefore the same labeling is required. Ever since enactment, FDA has logically held that this is an ongoing requirement that extends beyond the date of approval. However, on November 13, 2013, the FDA issued a proposed rule that would allow manufacturers of generic drugs to unilaterally change their safety-related labeling, deviating from the brand. Both FDA's legal and policy rationale for this change is dubious at best. Currently, a generic can only change its label when the branded drug does so and FDA approves the change. In that case, all generics are then required to adopt the same new labeling in a timely manner. This system does not obviate the need for generics to bring new safety-related information to the agency as soon as possible. Ostensibly, the proposed change is designed to help speed newly acquired safety information about drugs to the consumer. However, FDA has not explained how this rule would actually improve communication of drug safety information to prescribers and patients, other than establishing a website on which they will post the various labeling proposals. The only outcome I see if the rule is enacted is mass confusion. The FDA-approved labeling would essentially become just one in a crowd. The proposed rule undermines the sameness requirement in Hatch-Waxman and will result in situations where multiple FDA-approved therapeutically equivalent products will have different safety-related labeling prior to the FDA determining whether such changes are even necessary or appropriately tailored. Not only is the proposed rule in direct conflict with the plain language of the statute, but it directly contradicts numerous FDA statements and assertions over the years that consistent drug labeling is necessary if consumers and prescribers are to have confidence that generic drugs are as safe and effective as the reference brand name product. Finally, FDA has admitted that the proposed changes will open generic manufacturers up to greater liability under state tort lawsuits. The added cost of litigation will also cause generic prices to rise exponentially. I thank all of our witnesses for being here today to discuss these important issues. Look forward to your testimony, and I yield the remainder of my time to Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, Dr. Woodcock, thank you for joining us this afternoon. For the past 30 years, since the passage of the Hatch-Waxman amendments to the Food and Drug and Cosmetics Act, a framework based on sameness between generic and brand name labeling has existed. Those amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act successfully created a safe and effective means by which safety information is relayed to the public. The Food and Drug Administration's proposed rule has the potential to upend 3 decades of stability and, unfortunately, upend the stability in a process that is working and working well. Allowing generic manufacturers to update safety labels unilaterally will lead to a fragmented system where confusion will abound. Multiple versions of important safety information existing for the same drug will result in confusion for patients and providers alike. As a doctor, when I prescribed a drug, brand or generic, I want to know what the indications and risks are. I want to know that a generic is truly a generic with the same indications and the same side effects of the brand? If I'm not sure, then why not just prescribe the brand drug and never mind about the cost savings? Mr. Chairman, if patients and doctors don't have the certainty, the benefits of utilizing generics, including cost savings, could very well be at risk. Confusion extending to patients and pharmacists will accomplish nothing and could lead to an increase in issues with prescribing medication and the overall health of our beneficiaries. This appears to be the latest in a string of proposed rules in which the administration is seeking a solution for a problem that simply does not exist. Safety is paramount. I thank the chairman for holding the hearing, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Sure, thanks, gentlemen. Now yields to the, recognize the ranking member, Mr. Plum, 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Pitts, for having this hearing. The issue regarding generic drug labeling and its impact on patient safety is an important one and merits a thoughtful discussion. Hatch-Waxman is a true success story, one of the many that my colleague, Mr. Waxman, has been part of in his great career here. And because of this groundbreaking law passed 30 years ago, the drug market has transformed. Today, more than 80% of all drugs dispensed are generic drugs. In fact, for 45% of generics sold, no branded product is currently on the market. So I think we all agree that this is a good thing for patients and payers. But despite this reality, the FDA's regulation over the way in which generic drugs are labeled has remained unchanged. And I believe that in order for consumers and doctors to have confidence in the drugs that they take and prescribe, the FDA should facilitate a process which ensures that the responsibilities upon drug manufacturers reflect the current marketplace. Last November, FDA proposed a regulation that would allow makers of generic drugs to update safety labels independently without waiting for FDA approval to reflect new information on safety issues. This is identical to the process that brand name drugs use to communicate safety issues as timely as possible. This proposal is also a result of a troubling decision by the Supreme Court in 2011 that generic drug manufacturers cannot be held liable under state tort law for inadequate labeling, and therefore patients who have been injured by inadequately labeled drugs have no recourse in court. Being able to hold manufacturers accountable for maintaining adequate labeling through the court system is an important added layer of consumer protection. And what you will hear directly from the law's author is that Congress never intended to give generic drug companies immunity from liability. In fact, prior to 2011, they did not get immunity, and so I appreciate that FDA's proposal would address this interest. I agree that something needs to be done. Today we'll hear from critics about the consequences of the proposed regulation, in particular that it will lead to overwarning, higher generic drug prices, and the potential for some companies to even stop making certain drug products. These are bold claims, so I'm interested in better understanding the basis for their views. I believe the FDA has taken a critical step forward for patient safety, but I do have questions about FDA's approach. One issue in particular is that of sameness. Hatch-Waxman established the important principle of sameness for generic drugs relative to their branded counterparts. And this principle is significant in many ways, not the least of which is to ensure consumer confidence that generic drugs are just as safe and efficacious as brand name drugs. So I'm interested in learning more about FDA's consideration of the sameness principle, in particular how such temporary differences in labeling as a result of this proposal may impinge on the benefits afforded by sameness. So, Mr. Chairman, this is a proposed rule. Like with all other regulations, FDA will and should take a serious look at the many comments that they're sure to receive. But I want to make no mistake about it. I do support their efforts. In today's marketplace, consumers must have confidence in the generic drug industry, and I look forward to our witnesses' testimony, and I thank them for their participation. And I would yield back at this time.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ordinarily, you'd go to your side of the aisle, but you oh, I see. Okay. It's been 30 years since enactment of the Hatch-Waxman generic drug law. This law has been a tremendous success. Over 80, if I don't say so myself. Over 80% of prescriptions in the United States are generic. Consumers and payers have saved over $1 trillion over the last decade alone. Today we're looking at one aspect of this law and in particular in light of the proposed rule by the Food and Drug Administration to give generic drug manufacturers the same rights and responsibilities as brand name drug manufacturers to temporarily update safety information in their labeling without waiting for FDA approval. The proposed rule, if finalized in its current form, would be an important step forward for patient safety. It would remove obstacles to getting new safety information about drugs to doctors and patients at the earliest possible time. It would also restore the added incentive provided by state tort liability for generic manufacturers to comply with their obligations to conduct robust post-market monitoring and to keep their drug labels accurate and up to date. And it would restore the ability of patients harmed by taking an inadequately labeled generic drug to pursue redress through the courts, just as they were able to do before the Pliva versus Mensing Supreme Court decision in June 2011. Now, critics of the proposed rule have argued that it will lead to overwarning. They have argued that it will result in higher generic drug prices. They have argued that it will drive generic drug companies out of business or cause them to stop making certain products. And they've argued that it conflicts with the sameness required in the Waxman-Hatch Act. I don't believe those claims. We've heard the exact same claims about overwarning and drug company economic distress 6 years ago when the Supreme Court decided in Wyeth versus Levine cases. The court ruled that the FDA regulation did not shield drug manufacturers from state failure to warn tort liability. But since then, we have not seen any of these dire predictions come to pass. When we enacted the Hatch-Waxman bill in 1984, we did not give generic drug companies immunity from liability. In fact, the industry did not get immunity until 2011 when this Pliva case was decided. The tremendous growth of generic drugs from 84 to 2011 proves that the generic drug industry can flourish without immunity from state liability. The one issue for which I do have some limited sympathy is that of sameness. Sameness is fundamental to Waxman-Hatch. Generic drugs are the same as their brand counterparts. They are proved based on demonstration that they are chemically the same and have the same effects in the body. And because they are the same, they are required to have the same labeling as the brand at the time of approval. It's also important that the labels remain the same thereafter. But this does not mean that there can be no differences. There can be differences for brief periods of time when labeling updates need to be made, just as there can be because of differences in inactive ingredients or indications. In fact, the existing regulatory policy under which brands may update their safety labeling without waiting for FDA approval also results in temporary differences between the brand and generic label. These temporary differences occur during the time between the brand makes its label change and the time when FDA approves it, and then the generic manufacturer actually makes conforming changes. Few would argue that the current process violates the sameness requirements. FDA has tried in its proposal to minimize these differences to the extent possible. Experience will tell us whether the mechanics of the process FDA has proposed will need to be improved. If refinements are needed, I hope the FDA will make them. But I applaud FDA for releasing this proposal now and urge the agency to finalize it quickly after reviewing and taking into account all the comments. I believe the rule will result in even greater consumer trust and confidence in the generic industry, trust and confidence that I'm very proud to share. I thank the chairman for holding this hearing. I look forward to the testimony of the witnesses. I yield back the time.
Chair, thanks to gentlemen. All the other members' opening statements will be made part of the record. We have two panels before us today, and on our first panel, we have Dr. Janet Woodcock, Director of the Center for Drug Evaluation Research, U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Thank you for coming today, Dr. Woodcock. Your Your written testimony will be made part of the record. You'll have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. So at this time, Chair recognizes Dr. Woodcock for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I'm Janet Woodcock, Director of FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify. I'm happy to discuss FDA's proposed rule that would provide generic drug makers with the same opportunity as brand drug makers to update their labels when they have new safety information. They would also be able to distribute the revised label before FDA reviewed it by submitting a changes being affected supplement. It's known as a CBE supplement. This would speed dissemination of new drug safety information to health professionals and patients. Now, this is a proposed rule. The comment period closed about 2 weeks ago, and we're now reviewing comments. While I'm free to discuss the proposal, I'm not able to discuss what we may or may not do further. FDA-approved generic drugs are copies of brand drugs. They have the same safety and effectiveness as brand drugs for their approved indications. They're held to the same quality standards as brand drugs. And generic drug makers right now have the same obligation to monitor their drug safety as the brand drug makers do. But currently, only the brand drug makers can update their label with new safety information and distribute the revised label before FDA reviews the change. They do this by submitting a CBE supplement. Generic drug makers must wait to change their labels until the FDA approves the brand name change. In today's world, when over 80% of all U.S. prescription drugs dispensed are generics, and brand drug makers may drop out of the market after generics are approved, FDA believes it's time to provide generic drug makers with the means to promptly update their labels. In fact, for over 400 drugs, the only marketed drugs are generics, and we expect that this number will increase over time. The proposed rule, if finalized, would allow the generic drug makers to use the same process that brand drug makers use to update their safety information. It would ensure that all manufacturers marketing the drug, other generics as well as the brand, would be promptly advised of the new safety information. And we also propose to establish a dedicated web page where FDA would post information about these proposed changes submitted in CBE supplements for all drug and biological products so that healthcare providers and patients could have access to this information while FDA is reviewing it. FDA would make an approval decision on the proposed change for the generic drug and the corresponding brand drug at the same time, so that after FDA approved a change, the brand and generic drugs would all have the same FDA label, FDA-approved label. After FDA approves a label change for the brand drug, the proposed rule would set up a 30-day time frame in which the generic drug makers would submit conforming changes to their label. Right now, the situation is FDA currently advises generic drug makers to update their drug labels at the earliest time possible after a change to the innovator. And the time in which they actually do update that varies quite a bit. So in light of that range of time frames where generic drug makers currently submit supplements, the proposed procedures would likely minimize the current variation between brand and generic labels that is in existence right now, and would cause, I think, less confusion. Because there are no time frames stipulated by FDA, and there are often considerable delays before all the generic drugs labels are updated. Therefore, any confusion that might be caused by different labels would be reduced by this proposal. In conclusion, I want to emphasize that this proposed rule, if finalized, is intended to improve the communication of important drug safety information to both prescribers and patients. Thank you, and I look forward to answering questions.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady, and I will begin the questioning and recognize myself 5 minutes for that purpose. Dr. Woodcock, in 2011, in a brief submitted to the Supreme Court in Pleva versus Mincing, FDA argued on the merits, and both the majority and dissenting opinions agreed that a generic manufacturer could not unilaterally change its labeling without violating the plain language of Hatch-Waxman. FDA has taken this position for more than 20 years over the course of various administrations. FDA argued in the 2011 brief that generics do, however, have a duty to provide adequate warnings, and that they discharge this duty by promptly contacting the agency about new safety information so that FDA can make an informed decision about any labeling changes the agency determines are warranted, without citing any evidence in the proposed rule or in the agency's response to the bicameral letter we sent in January. FDA now speculates that generic companies will stop meeting their post-market requirements under the law. Despite all their previous assertions to the contrary, and despite the fact that they took the exact opposite position in 2011, FDA is now claiming that the Hatch-Waxman Act does not in fact preclude a generic company from unilaterally changing their labeling to strengthen warnings, and that they should now be able to do so because the market has matured. Dr. Woodcock, the market has not matured all that much since 2011. What really prompted the FDA's decision to fundamentally change its position on these matters, and what role did plaintiffs' lawyers play in the process?
For FDA to look into this rule was partly by the court ruling that pointed out a disparity in the obligations between the generics and the innovator drugs. And in today's world, a world where the generics are more than 80% of all prescriptions dispensed to patients in this country, we feel the standards should be the same. The standards for manufacturing, the standards for safety and efficacy, the standards for overseeing safety, and the standards for reporting to FDA. So we wanted to have a level playing field, have the same standards, and correct this inconsistency.
Now, in February of 2013, while FDA was drafting this proposed rule, agency's officials met with several plaintiffs' lawyers, including at least one representative from the American Association for Justice, also known as the Association of Trial Lawyers of America. In fact, according to FDA's public calendar, one of the agency participants in this meeting was Daniel Siegelman from the Office of the Commissioner, who is himself a former prominent member of trial bar. Would you please provide the committee with the minutes from this February 2013 meeting?
We will get back to you with what we have.
Would you commit to working with the committee to provide any other communications between agency officials, including Mr. Siegelman and representatives of the American Association for Justice, relating to the proposed rule or other approaches that were considered?
Certainly.
Now, I'm going to read a statement from a separate brief submitted to the Supreme Court by Ranking Member Waxman and ask you to comment. Quote, "It is clear that a generic and a brand name label must be the same, and that a generic firm cannot unilaterally change its label. To permit individual generic drug labels to differ significantly from their brand name counterparts, particularly with respect to safety information, would thwart the sameness goal reflected in the Hatch-Waxman amendments." Dr. Woodcock, did the agency agree with this statement in 2011, and does the agency agree with this statement today?
All right. With certainly all due respect to Mr. Waxman, who is obviously the author of the legislation, I'd like to dispel the notion that the labels are the same now with respect to safety information. We have looked at this, and it's not just the CBE0, but when we, say, do a class labeling, say for the NSAIDs, we put a box warning in, some major safety change is put into drug labels. There is a time frame that can be considerable under which the generics submit conforming labeling. And during that time frame, those labels are different. And in fact, I would submit to you from a practical point of view, as I administer the program, these drug labels are dynamic, and they change up to maybe 10 years, 15 years. I think our latest is 38 years after a drug's been on the market. We're still discovering safety information. That needs to get onto the label as quickly as possible. The generic copies may take quite a long time, months, perhaps a year or so, before they make conforming changes to their label. And then, of course, that takes much longer to get out there in circulation because the print nature of the package insert. So while in principle they are the same, because of the dynamic nature, they are not literally and exactly the same right now. And the proposed rule, if it were enacted, would actually narrow down that time, that disparity, that temporary difference. And after FDA would approve, maybe we'd not put the safety label in, or maybe we would decide that a safety update goes in a drug label, then all the manufacturers of that drug would have to change, and the generics would have 30 days in which to do that.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Now recognize Ranking Member Ms. Plone, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Woodcock, Mr. Neese, I guess, NEAS, who's here today representing the generic drug makers, argues that FDA should focus on assuring patient safety and not on preemption of state tort law. I agree with the FDA that state tort law complements FDA oversight and enhances patient safety. My reading of the FDA proposed rule is that its primary purpose is to realign FDA post-market safety monitoring and labeling requirements with the realities of the current marketplace, and to increase the speed at which new drug safety information gets to doctors and patients. So I just wanted to ask you initially, is that a fair reading of the purpose of the proposed rule, and if you wanted to comment on that?
That is correct. With over 80%, as we've all said, of drugs taken by Americans today being generic drugs, and many of the generic drugs not having an innovator copy on the market, the goal is to make sure that the whole system is searching for and promptly searching for safety problems and promptly updating labels when they are found.
So another criticism made by Mr. Neese is that requiring generic manufacturers to make unilateral labeling changes will lead to a flood of unnecessary and different labeling changes and confuse doctors and patients. And he also claims that companies will exaggerate the risk of their drugs, leading patients to avoid taking needed medications. I know that in the lead up to the Wyeth versus Levine case, brand drug companies made similar predictions of overwarning if the Supreme Court were to rule against preemption, as it did. So I guess a couple things. First, has FDA found that drug companies commonly overwarn?
Well, we have existing precautions against that. Our regulations that we passed a few years ago called the Physician Labeling Rule, which modernized the drug package insert, has specific caveats about doing such things and requires certain levels of evidence before you just put warnings in the label. Many of you may not have looked at a drug label, but long ago they were what we called the laundry lists. They were just long lists of things that might happen to you. And the modern drug label has eliminated much of that because it's not informative.
Did the FDA see a worrisome increase in overwarning after Wyeth versus Levine?
Not to my knowledge.
And does FDA believe that, this concern about the overwarning, do you think that's warranted?
I think it's important to stress that these warnings are temporary. They are put up there because something has been discovered and the company feels there's a reasonable link to the drug. Then after that occurs, right now with the innovator, we take a look at that and we gather up whatever evidence there might be, and we may have studies or other things that are brought to bear, and then FDA makes a decision about whether that's actually going to be approved FDA labeling or not. and the same would be true here with this proposal.
All right, let me ask you about the mensing decision. Were generic drug companies subject to failure to warn liability before mensing?
Well, first of all, let me remind everyone, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a physician. But I understand that for many years prior to the mensing decision, the generic drug manufacturers were generally considered to be potentially liable for failing to warn of important drug safety information. And during that time, they grew to about 75% of the U.S. retail prescription market. In other words, that the industry thrived during that time.
So is it fair to assume that finalizing the FDA rule essentially would bring the generic industry's liability situation back to something similar to what they faced before the mensing decision in 2011?
I think that's a reasonable assumption, but I would, again, argue that I'm not very qualified to opine on that.
I mean, we've all heard that well, I guess this GPHA commissioned a study looking into the economic impact of the FDA rule, and it concluded that finalizing the FDA rule will lead to new liability protection costs for the generic drug industry of about $4 billion a year, and yet the costs attributable to the FDA rule sound like they may be very, really not different from the liability costs the industry faced prior to mensing. So, I don't know, just, I'm questioning the value of the study. You don't have any comment?
It requires a lot of assumptions to make those conclusions.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. I recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Woodcock. Appreciate it very much. Thanks for your testimony. First question, depending on the drug, there could be a dozen generic products for the same brand drug. From a public health standpoint, don't you believe that the multiple different version of labeling will lead to confusion among doctors?
Well, in fact, the state is now, when FDA makes a label change to the innovator, there will be multiple different versions because the generic drugs will be changing. We've seen the drug makers will change their label over a period of time. Some will change their label to conform very rapidly. Others may take a year or so. So that is the current situation.
Okay, next question. The FDA frequently issues guidance documents better informing industry of FDA's expectations. How many guidance documents has FDA issued related to updating of generic drug labeling in the past decade? Can you give me that information?
I can't, but I could get back to you on it.
Please do. Isn't it true that the FDA currently has the regulatory authority to set specific time frames within which a generic company must update their labeling to conform to the brand name equivalent? And doesn't FDA have the authority to take regulatory action against any company that doesn't comply with the agency's requirements?
For the first one, for the second part of your question, do we have the ability to take action? Yes, I believe we do. And for the first part of your question, that's part of this rule. We would be stipulating, the proposed rule stipulates a time frame in which the generics would have to conform. And I think we do have that ability. We show that by proposing this rule.
Okay. If FDA feels as though it is not getting adequate post-market safety information from companies as required under the law, isn't it the agency's responsibility to better enforce these requirements to ensure that it does?
Well, I think that's a more complicated question than you might. It's a very complicated question. This proposed rule is about giving companies the ability to rapidly change their label and communicate information that they have found. All right. Generic drug companies do not frequently submit new safety information to the FDA. What we usually audit companies for is their required apparatus that they have to monitor for safety and to report to us to make sure that they operate those functions. For example, for a generic drug where there was no innovator, on the market anymore. We would really like to know that the generic drug companies were out there watching and seeing what is happening with their drug and telling us if they come across any new safety problems.
Okay, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now yields to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I feel like I'm in a Woody Allen movie when they asked about Marshall McLuhan, and the man in the back of the line said, "I'm Marshall McLuhan, and everything you said was absolutely wrong." Well, I'm Henry Waxman from the Hatch-Waxman, and I'm here to set the record straight. I submitted a brief to the Supreme Court, and I stated generic and brand name labels must be the same, because after all, the generic drug has to be the same as the brand name drug. So the warning labels have to be the same. But that was in the context of the existing FDA regulation that said the brand name companies could change their label if they know something more that they ought to tell the consumer, but the generic companies could not change their label. And they couldn't act unilaterally. So I was making the point that even within that context, generic manufacturers should be subject to the state failure to warn tort liability. That was my argument. The court didn't accept it. The court said you have FDA regulations, and what we were arguing was not consistent with them. Now you're proposing a new regulation. My amicus also contained the statement that to permit generic labels to differ significantly from their brand counterparts, particularly with respect to safety information, would thwart the sameness goal reflected by the Hatch-Waxman Act. So I still believe that to be true. However, I don't think allowing a temporary period of time in which the labels may be different thwarts the sameness goals. For example, you have existing regulations called CBE0, and that allows the brand name company, when they learn some problem, to change their label, even if FDA doesn't approve it. FDA may later approve it. They have to send it to FDA, but they can act on their own unilaterally. That would mean the warning label would be different than that on the generic drug. Isn't that right, Dr. Woodcock?
That's correct. And also the generics may take various amounts of time, even when FDA's approved the label change, to change their own, conform their own label.
So we have a period in time I'd like to be kept at a minimum before the labels are the same, but there is a difference in time, and no one argued that that violates the Hatch-Waxman Act. Sameness in labeling is important, but also finding out about new problems is important. You mentioned an example to Mr. Bilirakis. What if the generic was based on a brand that's no longer on the market? Would we prohibit a generic that learns about problems from doing anything to warn the public about these problems? I think that was one of the issues that you had in mind in proposing this new regulation. Isn't that right?
That is correct. And increasingly, the innovator companies are concentrating on innovation and dropping their drug or withdrawing it from the market, or even withdrawing their application after the drug goes generic because they can't compete or they don't want to compete in that space. And so there the generics are responsible. They must stand behind that drug because there is no one else watching the safety of that medication other than, of course, the FDA.
The FDA, but the generic manufacturers, which may be the only manufacturers of the drug, are more likely to hear about the problems for which they need to warn the public. And hopefully they'll give that to FDA, but they're the ones who are making a drug that could be harmful unless people understand the warnings that should go with it. Isn't that right?
That's correct. And most of the reports we get about 1 million reports a year about drug safety problems, and about 80% of those are from the manufacturers.
Okay. So I think there needs to be sameness in labeling. I think that's critical, but equally important is ensuring that patients know they will have the same right to access courts when they're injured by taking a generic drug as they would if they took a brand drug. We don't want to scare consumers to think, oh, if I take a generic, I may be taking something that is not as safe. That has always been the brand name industries claim that's not the same. It's not the same. It's not as safe. But of course, if they are the same and the warnings are the same, then the consumer should relax. And we want to get to that same labeling. Mr. Neese and Mr. Shumsky claim that the proposed rule fundamentally violates the sameness principle and it undermines the statutory and regulatory framework for approving and overseeing generic drugs. How do you respond to that, Dr. Woodcock? There are differences that occur now between brand and generics when brands use their existing CBE 0 process to up to their safety labeling. What you would be doing is giving the generic that same opportunity. Do you think that this is going to mean that we're going to have less sameness in drug label?
I believe the portions of the rule that call for the web page and then call for all generic, all the labels to be conformed within 30 days will result in less differences among brand and generic labels in the future if this rule were to be made final.
That's a good objective. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Dr. Woodcock. This is a very complicated topic. As I understand the recent Supreme Court decisions, there is a question legally as to whether the proposed rule complies with those decisions. I certainly want the public to be as safe as possible, and at the same time, I don't want the public to be confused. Do you see any potential of a conflict between safety, which we all desire, and confusion among the public on this issue?
Well, as we've been talking about a little bit, I believe if the proposed rule were implemented, it would reduce confusion caused by differing labels because there would be more conformity of labels, right?
As I read the underlying statute, it appears to me to be clear, and it's my own opinion that what is proposed may go beyond what is currently in the underlying statute, and obviously agencies try to administer underlying statutory law to the best of your ability, given your responsibilities in the executive branch. Would it have been better for the agency to come to us here to Congress to ask for an amendment if you thought that you needed to move forward in the way you are apparently moving forward?
Yeah, it's hard for me to speculate on that. I'm not a lawyer. I would say that...
That speaks well of you. Some of us are lawyers.
Well, I don't, opine as a lawyer. I'm not one. However, I will say that we have been administering this program a long time. The generic drug labels are actually different in many areas, some of which have been stipulated by Congress. For example, pediatric exclusions, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole, and they are different in their safety information due to the time frame often that takes, and due to the fact that the generic industry does not often update their label in a timely manner.
Thank you. I would hope that on issues like this, the executive branch and the legislative branch could work together, and often where you stand on an important issue of public policy is based upon where you sit, and sitting in the legislative branch of government and having reviewed the underlying statute and certainly having great respect for those who wrote the statute, including Mr. Waxman, I tend to view the opinion of Mr. Shumsky and others as how I would read the underlying statute. I realize it's extremely complicated, but I would prefer if the executive branch and the various agencies might come to us if an amendment would clarify the situation and certainly statutory law, from my perspective, serving in the Congress, is the bedrock by which agencies proceed, recognizing as I do that the safety and health of the American people is preeminent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Sure, thanks, gentlemen. And at this time, recognize the gentlelady from Virgin Island, Dr. Christensen, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back, Dr. Woodcock. Dr. Woodcock, FDA describes both the existing and the proposed CBEO processes as an exercise of enforcement discretion. And that sounds like either the agency is deliberately flouting the will of Congress or the law is so badly written that FDA can only make it work by ignoring parts of it. Yet I know that FDA uses enforcement discretion in many areas of regulation with good effect. Could you put your use of enforcement discretion in the CBE regulations into context? Could you explain how the agency uses it elsewhere in its oversight of drugs or other FDA-related products, and why you've chosen to use it in this instance to allow drug manufacturers to rapidly update their safety information?
Well, first of all, I understand that originally when the CBE 0 regs were written, that was how it was described in 1960, a long time ago, all right? Maybe I was in high school. Yeah, but I think that what I understand from our lawyers now is that we do not regard this. We regard this as the statute, of course, sets a framework, as has just been pointed out, that regulations are implementing of that framework. We regard this as implementing and interpreting part of the statute. So I'm not sure we regard this as, in today's world, legal world, as enforcement discretion. But we do use enforcement discretion in many areas. For example, one of the most poignant is probably our dealing with the shortage issues, where we are getting products from around the world for critical medical needs that are being not met for our population after we verify that they're correctly manufactured and of high quality. We will have them imported into the United States.
Well, thank you. Well, whether it's enforcement or not, I think the whole process seems consistent with one of the overriding purposes of the Food and Drug Law to protect patient safety. Also in his testimony, Mr. Nees notes that generic manufacturers only have access to information about their individual products, saying that FDA is the only entity with access to all safety information and is the only body in a position to decide whether a labeling change is warranted. How do you respond to those points?
Well, what we're talking about here is sort of early notification. That can be done now by the innovator to change their label in advance of an FDA decision. And what we're saying, proposing, is that the generic industry should be able to change their label in advance of an FDA decision. After we get a safety signal in, we may evaluate it through our Sentinel system. We may look at we may do a literature search, seek data from other sources, and generally deliberate and finally make a final decision. You know, should this be a box warning? Should it be a precaution? Is it a contraindication? Or is it just another warning? Or maybe, as was raised earlier, it isn't adequately linked and should not be on the label. Mm-hmm. Once we make that decision, we then are proposing here that we tell everyone all at once you should change your label to conform to the FDA decision. So yes, FDA would weigh in at the end of the day on this, but what we will do now, and as a clinician you're aware of this, we often, and it's frustrating somewhat, but FDA will put out safety information that says, we're looking at this. Mm-hmm. We don't know what it means yet, but people became very unhappy that we weren't notifying them that we were evaluating an issue. So if it's an important safety issue, we actually put out a drug safety alert and say, we're evaluating this, we don't know what the truth is yet, but we'll keep you informed and let you know when we've made a decision.
Thank you, and I agree basically. And as the proposed rule notes, not only do generic drugs now comprise over 80% of drugs sold, but they constitute 94% of the market for those drugs for which generics are available. So while many of them may not have a preponderance on the market, some are likely to have much more than the brand. And as a rule, As the rule makes clear, FDA continues to reserve for itself the final decision regarding proper labeling. Thank you, Dr. Woodcock.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Dr. Woodcock. Good to see you again. In proposing significant changes to prescription drug labeling requirements in December 2000, FDA under the Clinton administration found, and I quote, the use of labeling and product liability and medical malpractice lawsuits, together with increasing litigation costs, has caused manufacturers to become more cautious and include virtually all known adverse event information regardless of its importance or plausibility relationship to the drug. Do you agree with this statement, or is this no longer a concern of the agency?
The reason, that was the practitioner's labeling rule, the label modernization that you're talking about. And in there, we put in some standards that prevent putting in the label events that are not really causally linked, where we don't see a causal association. So we were basically putting people on notice that we did not think that those type of events, that laundry list, should get into the drug label. And the modernized drug labels do not have that feature.
So it's no longer a concern of the agency?
It's always a concern, but we have put in safeguards to make sure the modernized labels don't contain that.
All right. Before proposing the 2000 rule, the FDA held multiple focus groups and conducted a national survey of healthcare providers. Prior to issuing the proposed rule in November of 2013, did the FDA discuss these changes with physicians?
Yes, that was well, the physicians were part of the focus groups. We had a public.
No, I'm talking about this current rule you proposed.
Oh, this one. Oh, I'm sorry. No.
Did the FDA meet with any pharmacists to hear their thoughts?
No, not to my knowledge.
Did you meet with any of the branded drug companies?
Not to my knowledge.
What about the generic drug companies?
Not to my knowledge. No, I did not.
Did the FDA meet with the trial lawyers?
My understanding is that is the case. However,
so that's you didn't meet with physicians. This in 2000 you met with all these groups.
That's correct.
The new rule is you met, so you didn't meet with physicians. You didn't meet with pharmacists. You didn't meet with branded drug companies. You did not meet with generic drug companies, but you met with the trial lawyers. I think you've already testified as yes.
After the court decision, I sat down with the staff at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and we went over options for dealing with this disparity in the treatment of the two groups. All right, and we went ahead and drafted this rule. I was not aware.
So let me get back to. So the answer is yes.
My understanding is
you can just say it. Come on, get it out.
Part of the agency did meet with the trial lawyer.
Thank you. Now, because in your responses earlier, you talked about how innovator drugs, right, who may not be in the market anymore, and you have the generic drug. But it's funny you're using that as an explanation, but you didn't discuss this with innovator drugs. And you didn't discuss this change with the generics. So even in your answers to our questions today, you're using what you would think would be support from an inclusive process of an evaluation of a new rule without talking to these two groups. So let me ask you this question. What role did the trial lawyers play in applying and the development of this new rule?
To my knowledge, none, because, as I said...
Wait. You met with them, you changed the rule, and you're saying they had no role in developing this new rule?
Right. I was trying to explain that.
I know. I'm trying to believe it.
Yeah. Well, it's not a matter. I'm explaining factually what happened. All right. The Center for Drugs, I asked our staff here at the Center for Drugs to look at this finding, which pointed out we did not have a level playing field of sameness between the innovators and the generic drug firms. They developed a list of options. We picked what the option we wanted to pursue, and it was really a matter of feasibility and execution, and we developed that rule. The personnel in the Center for Drugs did not meet with the trial lawyers.
You understand why we have questions about this rule. If you met with just the trial lawyers and you didn't meet with any of the folks that are involved in this sector.
Certainly.
All right, thank you. I yield back my time.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman be given an additional minute so I could ask him to yield to me.
Do you want to have me recognize Mr. Sarbanes?
No, the ranking member is asking for unanimous consent for me to be given another additional minute, so I can then yield to the ranking member.
The chair recognizes the gentleman for 1 minute.
I'd be happy to, and I would then yield to Mr. Waxman.
Whoever you met with before is interesting, but don't you now have to have comments from everybody with the proposed rule and take those comments into consideration?
Certainly. The folks we met with before were about parts of the label that would really impact them, and this is more of a procedural issue, but we put together a procedure, we instantiated it in this proposed rule, and we've received over 100 comments from a wide range of groups, and we will be evaluating those comments.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we're claiming the rest of the minute. I understand that now you're going to receive comments. However, historically, you met with everyone involved in this sector. You now issue a new proposed rule with only meeting with the trial lawyers. I think that raises cause from concern, and the reason why many of these questions are going to for what purpose, and there's a question on intent, and I yield back my time.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Woodcock. You're one of the best witnesses we get up here, and I appreciate your testimony. I'm sort of baffled at what the objection could be to the proposed rule, and looking forward to the second panel to elucidate that for me. It seems eminently reasonable what you're trying to do. I think that it strikes exactly the right balance that we would want to see between the objectives, aspirations, and the success of the Hatch-Waxman Act, and then having to deal with practical obstacles that framework encounters over time. So it makes a lot of sense what's being proposed. And Congressman Waxman got right to the point I was going to make, which is I gather now the comments have been in as of 2 weeks ago, right? Mm-hmm. And those include a lot of perspective from consumer groups out there, people that are concerned about safety issues, presumably. Isn't that the case?
Yes, there are comments from consumers and consumer groups.
I mean, there seems to be this notion that if a trial lawyer has a positive opinion of the proposal, that somehow that should taint, undermine, or eliminate the concerns that the broad public has about seeing this kind of proposal. In fact, my view would be that they're largely reflecting the opinions and perspective of the broad public and those people who could be potentially damaged if you don't have a proper framework in place. Mm-hmm. So it's good to hear that those comments include organizations that would represent that kind of perspective on safety. And, you know, we look forward to seeing how the rule will roll out from here. I was curious, before the Menzen case, before this decision that appeared to protect or did protect the generic manufacturers from failure to warn cases at the state level, which was only a couple of years ago. Before that, as the industry was developing, presumably they were getting more engaged in monitoring based on the exposure and liability that they properly had vis-a-vis the public and consumers. Would that be accurate to say?
Yes, and as far as sameness, they have the same requirements for monitoring the recipients of their drug or any reports that they get of problems with their drug and reporting those to the FDA. So that is the same as for the innovator industry.
You mentioned that you think probably there's some assumptions in the projection that this will result in a $4 billion hit to the generic drug industry as a result of having this liability there. I'll be interested to hear testimony that backs those kinds of assumptions up, because I am skeptical of them, as I think you are, and certainly Congressman Waxman has indicated his skepticism about that. I'm very intrigued by your testimony that not only does the proposed rule not add to the sameness problem that's been discussed, but in fact it would help to remedy some of the problems that there's been with sameness, because there hasn't been in place the kind of timelines that would push the generic manufacturers to come into conformity on a more expedited basis.
That's correct.
So you have sameness issues now that are kind of initiated from the innovator brand side of the equation. You may now get situations where the sameness, that sort of glitch gets initiated from the generic side. But all told, what you're proposing, as I understand it, is a structure that will lead to more sameness, to use that sort of odd phrase, than less. And so that will be actually an improvement over the current situation. Is that correct?
That's correct. We would anticipate that the amount of disparities between the generic label and innovator label would decrease with this proposal, because we'll put in a 30-day clock for conformance to the labels.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I'll you back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Because we've just heard there may be some confusion over various views on this proposed rule, let me take this time to request unanimous consent to insert the following documents into the record. AARP letter to Commissioner Hamburg dated March 13, 2014. The FDA's proposed generic drug labeling rule and economic assessment by Alex Brill, February 5th, 2014. Letter from FDA to Congressman Kevin Yoder, January 29, 2014. March 6, 2014 letter from 24 members of the pharmaceutical supply chain to Commissioner Hamburg. The labels on generic drugs, the FDA should take the lead on making drug warning labels consistent. LA Times, article March 12, 2014. Committee letter to Commissioner Hamburg regarding the proposed change to generic drug labeling policy dated January 22, 2014, and the FDA's response dated February 26, 2014. A letter dated March 14, 2014 to Commissioner Hamburg from minority health groups. And finally, a letter dated March 13, 2014 to Commissioner Hamburg from patient advocates. Without objection, so ordered. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming, Dr. Woodcock. A lot of discussion on the topic of changes being affected involves generic drugs. It occurs to me that CBE is also an important policy issue in the context of biosimilars. What is the current legal status of CBE with respect to biosimilars, and would the proposed rule change the current legal status of CBE with respect to biosimilars? And I know that biosimilars, there's none have been approved by the FDA yet, but when they are, will they have CBE or not?
Well, this rule is not pertain to that, because those would be under the Public Health Service Act, and they're not considered generics like the generics are. So that's a separate issue.
Completely separate. Thank you. In your testimony throughout the day, you've stated 4 or 5 times that this rule would address the need for outdated generic labels to be updated. While that may be so, that was not the basis for the FDA issued the rule, the proposal. In fact, I've been told that the goal was not even addressed in the proposed rule. Why has the agency stated rationale for proposing this rule changed? And if updating outdated generic labels is really the goal, can't you address those administratively or with better enforcement?
Well, the goal of this is what, at least my goal and the Center for Drugs goal was to update what we felt was a disparate playing field for the brand industry and the generic industry, where the generic industry has really grown up to be taking care of much of the health care of your constituents in this country. The drugs they get at the pharmacy are generic drugs. And so that was the goal from my point of view. We are looking at updating old labels, and this isn't just a fault of the generic industry, it's a fault of the innovator industry too. Drug labels need to be modernized, and the modernization effort that was talked about earlier only went back to, I think, 2003. And so we are looking at updating globally the drug labels in general.
Is your FDA pilot project Sentinel? Is that focused on that? Is that what that is to do?
No,
the Sentinel system?
Sentinel system is using electronic health records to learn and look at safety signals that we get. So that's what Sentinel is about. We have electronic health records of 150 million people, and we can look in there and find out what happens when they took a drug and find out whether a side effect is real. We're doing a different pilot on modernizing drug labels that have become out of date.
Okay, and I have one last question. Ranking Member Waxman discussed the brief he filed with the Supreme Court in 2011. My understanding in that brief, a different approach than the one ultimately included in FDA's rule proposed was raised. I believe the brief suggests that FDA should formalize a process by which a generic manufacturer could provide the FDA with any new information they obtain regarding safety hazards associated with their products, and that they could be held liable if they failed to do so. Why does the FDA feel that was an inadequate approach, and why you have to go this direction?
I'm sorry, but I'm unfamiliar with what mechanism or that they were supposed to update their labels.
Yeah, I have a quote from the briefs that provide the FDA with any new information they obtain regarding safety hazards associated with their products.
Yes, well, generics have always been supposed to do that. So this is simply a mechanism. This is really a procedural rule that allows a procedure that was always available to the innovator to be allowed to be available to the generics as well.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and glad you're here, Dr. Woodcock. I think the three main criticisms of the proposed rules is that it would restore tort liability to generic manufacturers, which I don't know if that was the intent, but one criticism that the proposed rule restores the tort liability, which critics argue would lead to warning and significantly higher generic drug rates. Two, the rule undermines the sameness principle that generic and brand drugs have to be the same, including their labeling, and therefore undermines the entire Hatch-Waxman justification. And three, the rule would lead to a multitude of different labels, confusing doctors and patients, and undermining confidence in generic drugs. Frankly, I don't mind, if somebody's producing a drug, they ought to have some responsibility for it, so I don't have that bigger concern about the tort liability. But the other two I do have some concern about. Undermines the sameness principle that Hatch-Waxman did, and also the multitude of labeling.
Well, as I explained earlier, right now there's different versions of the label because the innovator will change their label even after FDA approves that label. It takes some time, perhaps for some cases a year, maybe 2 years for some of the generics, not all of them, to change their label. So there are differences out there between the innovator and generic labels that are disparities now. And this proposal that we have would reduce the time of confusion, if you want to call it confusion.
Okay. But is there any, then, the sameness principle issue that was brought up?
We feel I feel that the sameness applies, and if you're a consumer or patient, I think that you would want to know that the drug is the same as far as its chemical composition, as far as its pharmacology, and as far as the manufacturer standing behind that drug. All right? and doing the safety surveillance and the monitoring and keeping their label up to date, no matter whether they are innovator or a generic manufacturer. The sameness as a literal point of view, that the labels need to be exactly the same. They are not exactly the same, and there are a number of reasons. For example, the pediatric exclusivity. There may be certain constituents that are slightly different that is allowed. There may be other carve-outs to the label due to new indications that the innovator has that the generic doesn't have. And there are these differences due to the safety changes and other label updates that actually the generics don't necessarily update in a timely manner.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think consumers actually do look at labeling too, not just physicians, obviously physicians
Yes.
for the prescription. And I'll give you an example. Zyrtec is something that's been successful, but now it's lost exclusivity and there's a generic available for it that I've noticed still has the same compounds as Zyrtec. So consumers also look at it other than physicians. And I yield back my time.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Gangry, 5 minutes for questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and Dr. Woodcock, good to see you.
Good to see you.
What is wrong with the current process that the agency, the FDA, has defended as being necessary to bring orderly change to the labeling when it's warranted? What's wrong with the current?
As the universe has changed and time has changed, the generic industry is now in charge of much of the health care. It delivers most of the dispensed prescriptions.
Well, I know Dr. From the Virgin Islands mentioned that a little earlier, that maybe 85% of the drugs that are dispensed today are generic. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes, and in fact, in that situation, those manufacturers who are marketing those drugs, they need to be monitoring those drugs for safety. The people who market the drugs will get their reports, all right?
Let me ask you this, just a yes or no answer. The approach FDA now proposes will result in an orderly process that gets evidence-based, appropriately tailored labeling changes to prescribers in the best possible manner.
Yes.
It does, right. In this proposal rule, and I just came from another committee hearing where I was praising the trial attorneys, but this proposed rule sure seems to me to be led by the trial attorneys. I'm following up on what the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimka, said. And as a physician like me, I hope that you would disagree with this implication that the FDA trusts the trial bar to be the chief stewards of public health policy.
The impetus behind this rule was to have a level playing field in a situation where now the generic manufacturers make most of the drugs that your constituents take, and that they have the same opportunity to react to the reports that they get of safety problems and rapidly modify the labels and bring it to FDA's attention. There are about 420 drugs right now that have no innovator on the market. And so it will only be the generic manufacturers to whom those reports would come, or to the FDA directly.
Under the proposed rule, I understand that generic and innovator, now innovator is the same as the brand, the original drug that the company brought. I understand that generic and innovator companies could propose labeling changes through the CBE process, and that the agency would post all of these suggested changes on your website, on the FDA website, before you would approve them. That is correct, isn't it? And for multi-source drugs, those that are the exactly same, they're made by both the innovator and the generic companies. Isn't it possible that each manufacturer could have different warnings posted for the same risk?
It is possible, but of course that would enable us to move very quickly. We get these now from the innovator, say they do a CBE 0, or we may hear from a practitioner, we may have it reported to us, we may get from the literature. We quickly evaluate those, and we put out an FDA drug safety alert. I'm sure you're familiar with these. Sometimes we say we're just looking at this issue, we don't know the answer yet.
Yeah.
So we are an actor in this as well, but we need to be made aware of what the manufacturers know.
Yeah, well, you know, it seems like to me it'd be confusing for doctors and patients, let's say, to go online, up-to-date, WebMD, you pick it, and find different warnings and contraindications for the exact same drug. It seems to me that I don't see how that benefits public health when that happens.
Yeah, well, right now, of course, there are drug controversies, drug safety controversies, as you know. There's much on the blogosphere, on WebMD, and everything else about different reported papers with this cardiovascular risk, this risk. Generally, FDA will opine, will put out a safety alert and say, we're evaluating this issue. Here's what we know so far. Here's what we don't know. We'll let you know when we have definitive information. When we do, then we would require all the manufacturers have the same label. When we had
well, that is good news in my concluding 10 seconds, because I was going to ask, isn't it the FDA's job to referee these disputes and make class-wide labeling changes?
Yes, it is, and we do that. Yes.
Chairman, I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. That concludes the questions of the Health Subcommittee members who are here. I'm sure they will have written questions that they will submit. But at this time, I'd like to seek unanimous consent to permit the gentleman, Mr. Braley from Iowa, to ask questions. And without objections ordered, Chair recognizes Mr. Braley, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate the committee's indulgence in allowing me to be part of the hearing. I want to follow up with a question, Dr. Woodcock, that Mr. Shimkus raised about input from physicians or physician groups. Mm-hmm. We heard from Mr. Waxman about the friend of the court brief he filed in the Mensing case. Were you aware that the American Medical Association, the largest physician organization in the country, also filed a friend of the court brief in that case?
No.
Okay. Assume for the moment that they did, and that one of the concerns they raised with the Supreme Court was the ethical dilemma that physicians face when they are confronted with inconsistent rules to protect their patients who receive brand name drugs, mm-hmm. as opposed to rules that protect their patients who purchase generic drugs. Mm-hmm. Is that the type of concern from healthcare providers that would be relevant to the agency in deciding whether or not to go forward with this rule?
Well, we just several weeks ago closed the comment period, and I hope that we got over 100 comments, some of them fairly voluminous, so I hope we've received input from a large number of sectors on this, including, obviously, the clinical community.
Mr. Lance raised concerns about similarly situated consumers being treated the same, but wouldn't that be an example raised by physician group, the largest in the country, that would show how these different consumers of medications can be treated differently, and that could raise concerns?
Well, I will say that certainly one of our issues is that the entities that are supplying medicine for a large number of patients in this country should stand behind their medicines.
One of the things that came up was Sentinel Systems in your testimony, and this is a common word that's used in trying to promote patient safety throughout the healthcare delivery system, correct? Mm-hmm. In fact, the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations uses a Sentinel event system that requires any adverse event to be reported and then followed up, so you get to the root cause of what caused the problem and develop an action plan to correct it. Are you familiar with that concept generally?
Oh, yes, I am very familiar
so
with it.
So don't generic manufacturers of drugs have the same safety incentives as a matter of public health to warn consumers as brand name manufacturers?
Well, I would certainly hope so. They have the same regulatory requirements to be monitoring for the impact of their drug and to find out if any new safety event happened and to report it to the FDA.
And one of the concerns about this proposed rule that I would think conservatives would be very happy about is that it promotes personal responsibility and not shifting the burden to take care of patients to taxpayers through publicly funded healthcare systems. Isn't that true?
Not being a lawyer, it's difficult for me to comment on that one.
If we don't have a remedy for people harmed by generic drugs, and they have to go on Medicare or Medicaid, we end up paying for it as taxpayers, don't we?
That would apparently be the case sometimes.
Would the gentleman yield to me?
I only have a few more minutes left.
I know I wanted to take it. Never mind.
One of the things that we know is there have been concerns raised about the cost of the proposed rule, and we've heard testimony that 80% of the medications being dispensed are generics. The federal agency that is focused on promoting public health as part of the National Academy of Sciences is the Institute of Medicine. And they've spent a lot of time studying this whole problem with preventable medical errors and especially medication errors. And this is a book they released in 2007 called Preventing Medication Errors.
Right.
And in here, they write that in 2000, a study estimated that the cost of drug-related illnesses and deaths in the ambulatory setting in the United States was $177.4 billion.
Yes.
That's a lot of money.
Absolutely.
So if 80% of that marketplace is generic drugs, and that we'd be talking about a $140 billion cost associated with not reducing this problem and promoting patient safety. Isn't that true?
Well, I'm very familiar with that book. I think that put in a lot of different safety problems together when they made those estimates. However, I would say that it's imperative that everyone monitor the safety of drugs in the outpatient, in the ambulatory setting, and that we improve our outcomes of patients.
Well, in my 5 seconds left, I just want to mention Sophie Howe of Ames, Iowa, a young college student who was harmed by generic drugs and ended up having a lot of added costs associated with that, including payment of her student loans that were accelerated when she had to drop out of school because of her medical complications. And I think it's the human faces behind this problem that we should be thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll yield back.
Chair, thanks the gentleman. That concludes the questions. At this time, we'll have written questions that we'll provide to you if you can please respond to those. Thank you very much, Dr. Woodcock, for your testimony and for your patience today. Before I call the second panel, I ask unanimous consent to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes for statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I know this is extraordinary to allow this, but I am not going to be able to be here for the testimony on the next panel. But I did want to comment on the fact that there's a disconnect at this hearing, because people are talking about whether the label is going to be the same, how long it'll take to be the same, whether the doctors are for this or not for it. I just want to point out what's really going on at this hearing. The Supreme Court decision said that a generic drug manufacturer cannot be held liable under state law to warn people about the dangers of a drug that they manufacture, that they know about, because they can't put it in the label. Because under the law, they cannot change their label unless the FDA changes the label for the brand and the generic company. So in my brief to the court, I said, look, if they can't change their label, then they ought to be held liable under state law for the failure to let FDA know that there's a problem for which they ought to give some notice to the public. Seems reasonable to me, but the court on a 5-4 basis said no. The only thing that would make them liable is if they fail to warn by a label change. And they can't make that label change, and therefore the generic drug industry could open their champagne and drink to the success that they're never going to be held liable. And that's great if you're never going to be held liable for them, perhaps, but it's not great for the consumers. The FDA has looked at this issue and said, well, wait a minute. We have a requirement that brand name companies warn the consumer, and they can even change their label. And then while we're considering whether we're going to impose that label requirement on everybody, they could go forward with it. But the generic drug companies can't do that. Now, FDA is not looking at it from the legal liability They're just looking at it from patient safety. It doesn't make sense that if a generic company discovers there's a problem, not to have them warn people. And justice is required by the brand name companies. So they're changing the rules to be sure the consumer's protected. But in the process, it could and most likely would reverse the Supreme Court decision and make the generic companies liable for failure to warn people if they have the ability to warn them in a new label, just as the brand name companies have. So while we're talking about all these other issues, we're missing what's really at stake here. We're going to hear that, I think, in this next panel, because Mr. Neese and others are going to argue this is going to cost billions of dollars in liability that they hadn't had to worry about in the past. But I'd submit that that doesn't make sense. Before the Supreme Court case, they were liable, and they had to anticipate that. But they didn't have billions of dollars as a result of that vulnerability of liability. They were able to manage that reasonably well. And to expect, notwithstanding a report that we're going to hear about, which I very much doubt its validity, we're going to hear that this is a big matter. This is going to be huge liability for them. Well, whether it will or will not, they should be held to the same standards in order to protect the public. And I hope they're liable if they do something wrong by not warning people in a label change. Because if they have information that their drug, as they learn now, could harm people, they ought to make that label change. Certainly the brand name companies have to do it. So I wanted this chance to make this statement now because I'm not going to be able to be here to do it through questions. I just must say, Mr. Neese, you got a report. I just don't see it possibly being valid, and it'll be held up to some further questions by this panel. But I can't see how it's valid. It seems to me highly inflated. It's like all the people that when we come in here and we want to regulate them, they say, this will drive us out of business. Then when the regulations go into effect, they do it for a fraction of the cost. So I just think that the people ought to put in perspective what this hearing is really all about. And as I now straightened everybody out about what's significant, I'm going to leave you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now we'll have our second panel. Please come to the witness table, and I'll introduce them in the order that they will speak. On our second panel today, we have Mr. Michael Shumsky, partner, Kirkland & Ellis, Mr. Ralph Neese, President and CEO of the Generic Pharmaceutical Association, and Ms. Allison Zeeve, General Counsel, Public Citizen. Thank you all for coming. Your written testimony will be made part of the record. You'll each have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. And at this point, the chair recognizes Mr. Shumsky 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the subcommittee, thank you so much for inviting me to testify today. Though I've filed administrative comments on these issues for a number of clients as part of my law practice, I'd like to make clear at the outset that I'm testifying today in my personal capacity and that the views I express are solely my own. Over the past 30 years, the Hatch-Waxman Act has generated trillions of dollars in cost savings. That phenomenal success stems from a simple but brilliant insight. Because two drugs with the same chemical and biological properties will have the same safety profile, FDA can safely approve generic versions of a previously approved drug without requiring new independent clinical trials. And it's precisely because two drug products with the same chemical and same biological properties will have the same safety profile that the statute naturally requires that generic drug labeling be, quote, the same as the labeling approved for that product's brand name equivalent. In a single word, sameness is both the statute's animating principle and the driving force of its success. FDA now wants to permit generic drug warnings that are, quote, inconsistent with the labeling for the RLD, that's the brand name equivalent. The agency has no power to do so. In our system of separated powers, The executive branch is bound by the laws this Congress passes. Indeed, as the Supreme Court explained the very same year Congress passed Hatch-Waxman, quote, "If the intent of Congress is clear, that is the end of the matter, for the agency must give effect to the unambiguously expressed intent of Congress." By this standard, FDA's proposal is indefensible. It pays no heed to Hatch-Waxman's plain language, which explicitly requires generic labeling to be, quote, "the same as the labeling approved for the brand name equivalent." And indeed, the statute further bars FDA from even approving a generic drug for sale in interstate commerce if its labeling is not, quote, "the same as the approved labeling for the brand name drug." The proposal also ignores FDA's lengthy track record on this issue. Indeed, FDA has repeatedly recognized that generic labeling must be the same as the FDA-approved branded labeling at all times. It did so during the first Bush administration, during the Clinton administration, during the second Bush administration, and in its Supreme Court brief in the Mensing case earlier in this administration. And finally, FDA's proposal conflicts with the Supreme Court's recognition in both Mensing and in Bartlett that it is this Congress's statute, not merely FDA's regulations, that bars generics from using different warnings on their products. As the court put the point very clearly in Bartlett, quote, "Congress's decision to regulate the manufacture and sale of generic drugs in a way that reduces their cost to patients but leaves generic drug manufacturers incapable of modifying their warnings." In other words, Hatch-Waxman represents, as the court said, Congress's decision, not the FDA's. I firmly believe that Hatch-Waxman's sameness requirement is supported by sound public policy and that FDA's rulemaking proposal threatens to harm the public health, though those issues are beyond the scope of my testimony today. I also understand that the court's recent decisions in this area are controversial, but as the court recognized in Mensing and Bartlett, FDA has no power to adopt this proposal until this Congress changes Hatch-Waxman's core principle, the sameness requirement that has made that law one of the most successful pieces of legislation ever passed. I have 1 minute left, and I do want to highlight one thing, and it was, I think, a very telling and very important exchange between Dr. Christensen on the one hand and Dr. Woodcock on the other. Dr. Christensen asked Dr. Woodcock about the origins of FDA's CBE proposal. And as she made clear, that proposal originated as an exercise in the FDA's view of enforcement discretion, meaning that the agency would not enforce the law as Congress wrote it. She then said, however, over time, FDA has changed its mind, and now they interpret that to flow from the statute itself as opposed to the agency's disregard for the statute. Let me translate that answer so that there's no mistaking what it was. FDA has ignored the law so long that the law has changed. That is a fundamental reordering of our democratic process and a direct threat to the separation of powers. And I want to thank Chairman Pitts for holding this hearing so that we can explore those very important issues about the nature of our constitutional republic.
Chair thanks the gentleman. And recognize the gentleman, Mr. Neese, 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Good afternoon, Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Malone, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify on the FDA's proposed changes to generic drug labeling. I am Ralph G. Neese, President and CEO of the Generic Pharmaceutical Association. This year we commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Hatch-Waxman Act, which by any measure has been one of our most effective laws ever passed. This remarkable law, initially projected to save maybe a few $1 million a year, has saved the U.S. healthcare system more than $1.2 trillion over the past decade, $217 billion in 2012 alone. The quality and affordability of generic medicines is vital to public health and the sustainability of the healthcare system. The very heart and soul of the Hatch-Waxman Act is the sameness principle under which generic manufacturers must prove to the FDA that their version of a drug contains the same active ingredient as the brand product, is identical in strength, dosage form, and route of administration, and importantly for today's discussion, has the same labeling. These requirements give consumers, doctors, and pharmacists confidence in the safety and effectiveness of generic medicines. The top priority for generic manufacturers is assuring patient safety for the hundreds of millions of people who rely on our products to live healthier and longer lives. The companies proactively participate with FDA to ensure the timeliness, accuracy, and completeness of drug safety labeling in accordance with all current regulations. These manufacturers report all serious and unexpected adverse events to the FDA within 15 days. All others are reported quarterly or annually. The generic industry takes these responsibilities seriously. Unfortunately, the FDA's proposed rule would substantially undermine the enormously successful Hatch-Waxman Act. It put both patient safety and healthcare savings at risk. By directing generic manufacturers to make unilateral labeling changes without prior FDA approval, the rule creates a system whereby multiple different labels, including different warnings, can simultaneously exist in the marketplace for the same drug with the same active ingredient. Generic manufacturers only have access to the scientific and medical evidence for their individual products, representing a fraction of the total market. They do not have access to the clinical trial data and other proprietary information of the brand manufacturer or current information and data from other generic manufacturers. Only the FDA has access to all the data and information. A generic manufacturer that unilaterally changes its label, therefore, does so with incomplete information. It's difficult to overstate the negative implications of the proposed rule on patient safety and on consumer access to affordable medicines. Allowing for multiple different drug labels in the market for the same product would upend 30 years of law and regulation and create substantial confusion for everyone in the healthcare system. Uniform safety information provides certainty for patients and providers that they can rely on consistent information to inform their decisions in medical conversations. Identical labels also underscore the critical point that once generic medicines are approved by the FDA, they are proven scientifically equal to the brand medicine in terms of safety, efficacy, and quality. The risk of overwarning and the flood of unnecessary labeling changes is substantial. Multiple versions of critical safety information would inaccurately imply therapeutic differences between the generic drug and the brand drug that do not exist. The exaggeration of risk and inclusion of unsubstantiated warnings will cause provider confusion and discourage the use of beneficial treatments. In addition to seriously jeopardizing patient safety, the proposed rule would also burden consumers, businesses, and state and federal governments with billions of dollars in increased prescription drug costs. A recent economic analysis found that the proposed rule would conservatively add $4 billion annually to the nation's already high health care costs, including $1.5 billion in Medicare and other government programs. It should be no surprise that 19 organizations representing those populations that most rely on access to affordable generic drugs and representatives from virtually every sector of the pharmaceutical supply chain, most importantly, pharmacists and pharmacy organizations representing more than 100,000 pharmacists and 45,000 pharmacies have submitted letters to the FDA raising their significant concerns that the proposed rule could jeopardize patient access and patient safety. Unfortunately, neither the FDA nor the Office of Management and Budget conducted a robust cost-benefit analysis, as OMB is required to do, to examine the economic ramifications of this rule and increased health care costs. I am here today with a simple message. We can do better. GPHA fully supports a streamlined, efficient, and transparent process for timely submission and updating of safety information for generic drugs for healthcare providers and the public. A key element of any new system must include timely FDA review of all available clinical data and safety signals, including the non-public data of the NDA holder. Underlying this product should be one bedrock principle. Generic drug labels must be FDA approved. It must be based on scientific evidence. Such a system would advance our shared goals of protecting the public health and improving patient safety. Congress should ensure that the FDA has sufficient resources to do so. We would welcome the opportunity to work with others in the healthcare system in a multi-stakeholder collaboration on this matter. The FDA should hear from patient advocates, pharmacists, physicians, payers, not just trial lawyers, and others in the supply chain who could offer expertise, experience, and perspective. The sustainability of our healthcare system depends on the continued access to affordable generic medicines. We'll work hard to make sure that any changes to labeling rules and regulations protect patient safety, align with federal law, and do not hinder patient access to more affordable generic medicines. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks. Gentlemen, now recognize Ms. Z, 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Can you punch the, yeah, there you go.
Thank you. I'm General Counsel of Public Citizen and Director of Public Citizen Litigation Group. Our office submitted the citizen petition that the FDA granted in part by issuing the proposed rule that we're discussing today. Since 1984, despite considerable changes in the market, FDA regulation of generic labeling has remained substantially unchanged. Since 1985, at the request of pharma and other specific brand name manufacturers, the FDA has allowed the brands to make safety-related labeling changes without prior approval. The concerns that motivated the FDA to adopt this changes being affected or CBE option 30 years ago, the need to promptly inform patients and physicians, and the interest in efficiency and resource management apply equally today. FDA continues to lack the resources to be the primary instigator of post-approval labeling changes and cannot timely pre-approve every safety update. Therefore, today, with generics comprising such a large percentage of all prescriptions filled, to fulfill the goal of timely labeling updates to physicians and patients, the CBE process must be available to generic manufacturers as well. The majority of labeling changes are initiated by manufacturers, not by the FDA, and based on publicly available adverse event reports and medical literature. But the brand name manufacturer drops to a small percentage of the market very quickly after generics enter the market and often stops selling the drug altogether. More than 400 unique drugs fall into this category. In these instances, if generic manufacturers are not actively monitoring and proposing safety updates, no manufacturer is doing so at all. But at the same time, it's undisputed that critical safety information may come to light after entry of the generic onto the market and after exit of the brand name product. The concern that the proposed rule would result in confusing or inconsistent labeling is unwarranted, I think, based on unfounded worst-case scenarios and belied by current practice. For the past 30 years, brand labeling has been different from generic for months, or as Dr. Woodcock testified, up to a year even in some cases, after the brand updates the labeling. We've seen no evidence of confusion. And despite the sameness concern of Hatch-Waxman, variations in labeling are built into current regulations and have been for 30 years, such as the listing of different formulations or a different indication. Sameness has never been a literal requirement of the law. Yet again, physicians and pharmacists have not complained of confusion. In fact, the National Physicians Alliance submitted a comment to the FDA 2 weeks ago saying that confusion is not their concern. Their concern is updated safety information. Finally, the manufacturers have argued, and I think this is the real objection, that the proposed rule, if finalized, will expose them to liability for failure to warn. They argue that the proposed rule will increase the cost of generic drugs and that insurers may refuse to insure them and that some manufacturers may even decline to enter the market. But both recent history and current reality prove these theories wrong. Until 2011, generic drug manufacturers faced the same risk, same liability risk that they would under the revised rule, because until the court's decision in Pleva versus Mensing, generic companies could be and sometimes were sued for failure to warn, and many cases were resolved favorably to the patient. Even today, some lawsuits, although far fewer, are brought in cases where the generic has failed to make a required update. So the proposed rule would not create a new cost, but one borne and managed very well by the industry until just 30 years ago, and still borne fully today by brand name manufacturers. It's important to keep in mind, I think this has gotten lost today, that lawsuits for failure to warn when meritorious occur because a patient suffered injury due to the lack of an adequate warning. Thus, the many lawsuits about metoclopramide, for example. People took a drug for reflux and developed the neurological disease tardive dyskinesia, which is often permanent. Adverse event reports and studies documented this problem for years, but the brand name company did not revise the labeling, and the generic said nothing. Of course, the manufacturer is not responsible every time a patient is injured, but sometimes the manufacturers, including generic manufacturers, turn a blind eye, and the current system allows the generic manufacturers to do this. The result is more injury and more costs, because immunizing the companies from liability does not make the patient's costs go away. They're carried by the patients, the health insurance, and taxpayers. For this reason, by giving generic manufacturers the tools and incentive to update safety labeling, the proposed rule will lead to a cost savings. Savings in medical care for the patients will not be injured because they and their physicians are armed with updated information about safety risks. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. I'll begin questioning. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for that purpose. Mr. Shumsky, in responding to the bicameral letter sent to the agency in January, FDA decided not to answer the question whether the other sameness requirements included in sections 505J of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act extend beyond the date of approval. Now that FDA has taken the position that the statute does not, in fact, require sameness in labeling after the date of approval, could it now be argued that the sameness requirements for strength, dosage, route of administration only apply at the time of approval as well? Is this not an absurd result?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question, and I think it really hits the nail on the head. It does demonstrate the real absurdity of FDA's proposal, because once you take the position that sameness doesn't mean the same for labeling, there's no principled basis for saying that sameness does mean the same for strength, dosage, route of administration, or any of the other requirements in the statute.
Can you please explain why FDA cannot make this change without congressional action?
Sure. There are several reasons, all of which were recognized by the Supreme Court, originally in its Mensing decision in 2011, and then its Bartlett decision just this past term in 2013. The central statutory provision at issue here is Section 505J of the original statute, which specifically says that generic product labeling must be the same as the labeling approved for the brand name drug. There are a couple of other provisions in the statute that are equally relevant. One requires the Secretary, which is the Secretary of HHS, who's vested authority in the Commissioner of Food and Drugs when it comes to drug approval determinations. But it requires the Secretary to reject an abbreviated new application, that is a generic drug application, where its labeling is not the same as the branded drug. And finally, there is a more recent provision of the statute which specifically says that there are certain limited exceptions to the sameness requirement. We've heard about a couple of them, where an inactive ingredient in the product, like its coating, is different than the brand manufacturer. There's some specific exceptions. None of those exceptions apply to warning or safety-related information. And there's a further provision of the statute which says that for certain permissible exceptions, differences between generic and branded labeling will not be considered misbranded if certain criteria are met, but that language in the statute specifically excludes, in other words, it says, but not changes to the warnings section of the labeling, which I think represents Congress's explicit recognition that a generic drug which bore different warnings than its branded drug would be misbranded.
Now, some have stated that the proposed rule would simply return the legal landscape for generic manufacturers with respect to failure to warn cases to where it existed prior to 2011. Therefore, generic manufacturers would assume the same type of liability they had before the Supreme Court's decision. Is this an accurate assessment?
I don't believe that it is, Mr. Chairman. Prior to 2011, no federal court of appeals had held that generic drug manufacturers could be held liable for failure to warn. To the contrary, one court had addressed that question. In 2008, the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, which is based in Philadelphia, ruled that state failure to warn lawsuits targeting generic drug products were preempted. And prior to the Supreme Court's 2009 decision in Wyeth, that was the definitive word in the federal judiciary and the federal court system on generic liability. 2 decisions came after Wyeth, which did expose generic drug manufacturers to liability. One of them was called Mensing out of the 8th Circuit. The other was called DeMahie out of the 5th Circuit. And as we all know, the Supreme Court promptly reversed both of those decisions in 2011.
One more question I want to ask. Currently, there's a period where the brand and generic drug labeling differs. Usually, this occurs when a brand makes a labeling change on their end and the generic manufacturer has to make conforming changes. How is the scenario envisioned under the proposed rule different in nature and scope from what currently takes place?
Sure. It's a totally different situation. We start with the language of the statute, which says a generic drug has to have the same labeling that FDA has approved for the brand. And so there will be a period of time where a brand manufacturer executes one of these CBE 0 changes. FDA then has to consider it and approve it before a generic can implement it. This proposed rule has nothing to do with that scenario. This rule says a generic on its own, acting unilaterally, can go out, decide it doesn't think that the branded warning is good enough anymore, and put a warning onto its product that the brand hasn't considered and that the FDA hasn't reviewed. It's an apples and oranges situation.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. My time's expired. Chair now recognizes Ranking Member Mr. Pallone, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask Ms. Zeeb, today we've heard a lot about liability, and I think it will be important to begin our questions of this panel about the role it plays in this context. So for the benefit of our members, could you describe for us the role that tort liability plays regarding product safety generally, and more specifically in promoting the safety of drugs and other FDA-related regulated products? And could you describe some of the kinds of harm that have been the subject of failure to warn lawsuits?
Thank you, Mr. Pallone. I'll start by quoting to you from what the Supreme Court has said about state failure to warn suits in the drug context. The court wrote, "State tort suits uncover unknown drug hazards and provide incentives for drug manufacturers to disclose safety risks promptly. They also serve a distinct compensatory function that may motivate injured persons to come forward with information. Failure to warn actions in particular lend force to the FDA's premise that manufacturers, not the FDA, bear primary responsibility for their drug labeling at all times." I think one example, sort of prominent example of some of the public health benefits beyond for the individual plaintiff comes through the Vioxx cases, where a tremendous amount of information came to light only because of the personal injury suits, information that not even the FDA had had, and it really helped to move that process forward and eventually to get a very dangerous drug off the market and find out what had happened in that case. There are unfortunately a number of examples of drugs, branded and generic, that have caused serious safety problems. Unfortunately, only, according to one study, about half of serious problems are discovered in the first 7 years after a new drug is on the market. So even after the generic comes on the market, we're still finding new safety risks. I mentioned metoclopramide, which was marketed under the brand named Reglan in my opening remarks. Another example is Accutane. This one is sort of particularly heartbreaking because the patients who were injured were teenagers. They took the drug for acne. You know, the teenagers, it's purely aesthetic, right? But it's very important to the teenagers. They take this, and unfortunately, it can cause bowel disease that requires, in some cases, surgery, and it can really change their lives permanently and in devastating ways. And there was information for years in adverse event reports and medical literature that this drug could cause this serious problem, and the brand name did nothing. And again, the FDA does not have primary responsibility for labeling updates. It can't. It doesn't have the resources. That's the premise of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and of the regulations. But the brand name manufacturer did nothing, and the generics said nothing because they don't have to. When the FDA finally ordered a labeling change for Accutane to warn of this serious problem, the brand promptly removed it from the market. So today, this is a drug that has had serious risks added throughout its I think it's 20 or 30 years now on the market, and the only products of Accutane sold today are the generic. So nobody has responsibility for that labeling today.
Well, let me get to my second question. In my opening statement, I mentioned that I'm sympathetic to the questions surrounding sameness, which is the guiding principle in Hatch-Waxman. How do you respond to the claim that the FDA proposed rule fundamentally violates the sameness principle and will undermine the statutory and regulatory framework for approving and overseeing generic drugs?
Well, I'm glad you didn't say sameness requirement, because as I mentioned, sameness has never been a requirement. The FDA regulations have a section that lists exceptions to sameness, and these have been uncontroversial. The most relevant one is actually during the period after a brand makes a CBE change. The difference between the status quo today and after what I hope will be the FDA finalization of the rule is that that period of difference, that temporary deviation, may be instigated by the generics, just like today it's instigated by the brands, and the FDA has fashioned the rule to make sure that this temporary exception actually works a little more efficiently than it works today.
All right. I don't know if I have enough time. I think I don't have enough time for my next question now, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Zeev, were you an amicus in either the Mensing or the Bartlett cases? Or a litigant in some way?
My office filed an amicus brief in Mensing. And filed an amicus brief in Bartlett, I believe on behalf of Mr. Waxman.
Thank you. And are you in agreement with the Mensing and the Bartlett decisions?
No, I think that they were wrong as a matter of legal jurisprudence as well as policy.
I see. Certainly we can debate policy, but you believe the Supreme Court was wrong in both the Mensing and the Bartlett decisions?
Right, I do, but I also think it's important, particularly in Mensing for today, that the Supreme Court looked to the FDA's regulations and deferred to the FDA's view of those regulations in deciding that failure to warn suits were preempted. The court didn't hold that Hatch-Waxman required that result, but said specifically it was going to defer to the FDA's view about its own regulations.
Thank you. Mr. Shumsky, your view on Mensing and Bartlett?
I represented the petitioners in both of those cases, and I think the Supreme Court did a fabulous job.
Thank you. Thank you. And this is a situation where the question was litigated to the Supreme Court, and the court made its decision. As I stated to Dr. Hamburg, I think very often in these matters where you stand on issues of public policy is based upon where you sit. If we want to modify the underlying statute, Mr. Shumsky, do you believe we should ask Congress to do that through our statutory power?
I certainly believe that if Congress is of the mind that the public policy here needs to be altered to enable the kind of liability that the Mensing and Bartlett decisions rejected, that Congress needs to act to change the statute to do that. I remain firmly of the belief that FDA has no authority on its own to do that.
Yes.
And I would say I think there are very sound policy reasons underlying the Mensing and Bartlett decisions which would counsel against those changes.
And your testimony would indicate that in the administration of President Bush, Senior President Bush, President Clinton, the Junior President Bush, and President Obama, at least at the beginning of his tenure in office, your view was the view that was prevailing in the administrative agency. Have I got that right?
Yes, Congressman, that's correct.
Thank you. Why, in your opinion, has there been a change at the agency regarding this matter?
I can't speculate on what's prompted them to turn around after 30 years of taking the position that these labeling changes are impermissible.
Mr. Neese, do you have an opinion on that?
It would be speculative. All we have, however, right now is that the FDA after, as Mike said, 30 years of enforcing the law in a certain manner under several different Democratic and Republican administrations, made a change. And that change was precisely what the trial lawyers and Public Citizen recommended in 2011, 2013. They are the only ones, I believe, who met with the FDA, and I think that's a problem.
I'm sorry, Ms. Zeeb, you're welcome to comment.
Sorry, we didn't meet with FDA.
Just the trial lawyers.
The trial lawyers, thank you. They have a perfect right to meet with the FDA.
Absolutely.
And let me be on the record as saying that. If the rule is finalized, will it likely be a matter of litigation?
If the rule is finalized?
As in its current form.
My guess is there's a strong likelihood that it could be the subject of litigation from a variety of different perspectives and constituencies.
And Ms. Zeeb, what is your opinion on that? If the rule is finalized as it has been written, do you believe this is likely to be litigated?
Well, I'd like to answer that in two ways. I think given what the industry has been saying, it's likely that they're going to want to litigate because they've been saying that they will. But I also think that the rule is perfectly permissible under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, including the Hatch-Waxman amendments to that act.
Yes, thank you. I realize your opinion, but you believe it will be litigated was my question. You think it will be litigated?
Well, I believe that the industry has said that they're going to litigate.
Mr. Shumsky, do you believe there will be litigation?
It's certainly been discussed, but no final decision has been made to the best of my knowledge.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize a gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the panelists. I think this is the least absurd proposal to come forward from the FDA I've ever seen. I just wanted to mention that. I gather there's 3 basic objections to this rule or critiques of it. One is the increased cost that it represents. And I'm not convinced that the report that is forecasting those increased costs is based on valid assumptions. But let's assume that there will be increased costs. As an objection to the rule that should be the basis for not going forward, I don't think that's a dog that just doesn't hunt, because the American public would say it's worth some additional costs in the system to make sure that we are protected, and frankly, the costs that will be saved to whatever industries involved, as well as in terms of potential damage and harm to individuals and families and patients out there, the costs that will be saved make it worth that investment if you want to look at it in those terms. So I don't think the economic argument is going to carry the day here, and I noticed that neither of you led with that argument, Mr. Shumsky or Mr. Neese, probably because of that reason. The second objection is the notion that it will create confusion. And I read the letter that the pharmacists, among others, submitted to Dr. Hamburg that you cited, Mr. Neese, and they don't outright advocate against this rule. They advise caution, and they say the FDA and others need to fully explore the potential unintended consequences that the rule may have on patient access and national health care costs, et cetera. And I think that that's exactly what FDA is doing. They're trying to consider what the potential consequences here would be. They're also going to great lengths in the rule to actually reduce the potential for confusion and even reduce it from where it stands now, as I understand it. So I see that as progress. That then leaves the argument about kind of the statutory interpretation. I don't buy that either, because if you subscribe completely to the notion that this sameness principle has to have total integrity, then you'd also have to take the position that the brand name manufacturers should not be permitted to put these interim labels on their products as a matter of safety, because for some period of time you would be violating a very strict and literal interpretation of the sameness concept, because you would have a situation where you'd have some drugs that are identical to other drugs that have different labeling on them. It seems to me it's a very reasonable position for the agency to have taken up till now, that sameness ought to be interpreted in context of public safety, and that's why you've had a situation where innovators and brand name manufacturers have been putting these interim labels on their products, even though that for some period of time makes them different from the generic manufacturing labeling, because there's an understanding that, you know, we're doing the best we can here to protect the public, and we have to interpret sameness in that context. And I think bringing that same perspective and lens, as the agency is now trying to do, by making it sensible for the generic manufacturers to also make this change in their labeling for some small period of time, is perfectly sensible thing to do. And so I guess there's no questions in that. That's just my observation of the matter. But I continue to support fully the proposal that's been made. I think it's very, very reasonable, and I don't think it represents overreaching of the enforcement or interpretive discretion and authority that the FDA has. And with that, I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize Mr. Braley, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Shumsky, in your opening remarks, you made clear that your testimony here today was in your personal capacity. Do you remember that?
Yes, sir.
Have you or one of your family members ever been harmed by a generic drug?
I have experienced side effects associated with generic drugs. I'm not sure I would characterize that or any of my family's experiences as being harmed.
All right. Have you, in your professional capacity, ever represented a client who claimed to have been harmed by a generic drug?
No, sir.
You have represented generic drug manufacturers in front of the Supreme Court. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And were you here in my earlier comments when I talked about a young woman from Ames, Iowa, who'd taken a generic drug and had a really bad outcome?
I was, Mr. Congressman.
Okay. This is her picture. Her name is Sophie Howe, and she began having some of the same problems with a complexion medication that we heard mentioned earlier here today. Ended up having multiple pulmonary emboli, was hospitalized with that, and had significant complications. At the time, she was a college student at Iowa State University, and because of the complications of her injury, she was forced to drop out of school. She had student loans that were paid for and insured by the federal government that became due, and that caused her to drop out of a community college program in order to work full-time to pay off her student loans. So when you walk into the Supreme Court building across the street, you'll see a sign up above that says equal justice under law. But the actual result of the Mensing decision is to tell those claimants, like Sophie Howe, you have equal justice under the law if you pay more for brand name drugs, because she has no remedy under the court's decision, does she?
Not against the manufacturer of the generic drug product, no.
Now, Mr. Neese, I want you to know that I am glad that generic drugs are helping American patients by giving them access to affordable medications where and when they need them. And I also believe it's just as important that the medications on the market are safe and that patients and providers are aware of any possible threat to their health. In this Mensing case we've been talking about, were you aware that there was a friend of the court brief filed by 43 state attorney generals talking about the cost-shifting result of not providing this remedy?
I do know that the state attorneys generals took a certain position, sure, as they did.
In their brief, they noted costs should not be shifted to taxpayer-funded health care programs. This implied preemption would put added pressure on state and federal budgets. Not only would it be a significant incentive for ensuring the safe use of prescription drugs be eliminated, but injuries to consumers would go uncompensated by the wrongdoer, and much of the resulting increase in health care costs would be borne by state-funded programs. And, Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent for recognition that the brief was filed by the Attorney Generals from the states of Minnesota, Louisiana, Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Idaho, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kentucky, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Mexico, New York, North Carolina, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Utah, Vermont, Washington, West Virginia, Wisconsin, Wyoming, and the District of Columbia.
Without objection, so ordered.
Ms. Zeev, when we're talking about this cost shifting, are you aware that the same companies that are generic drug manufacturers were held accountable before the Mensing decision, either through settlements or through claims in court for failure to warn claims?
Yes, I'm aware that there were hundreds of suits, and at least in the few years leading up to Mensing, that there were a large number of settlements that are confidential at the manufacturer's request.
After the Mensing decision, are you aware of any instance where an insurer for one of those generic drug manufacturers rebated portions of premiums that had been paid based on a potential assumption of liability for failure to warn claims among generic manufacturers?
I'm not aware of that. I'm also not aware of any decrease in the cost of generics to consumers because of the elimination of liability.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Chair, thanks to gentlemen. That concludes the questions of the members. The ranking member has a unanimous consent request. You're recognized for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that the committee include in the record the following: a comment letter to the FDA on the rule by 41 members of Congress, including myself and Mr. Waxman, New York Times editorial in support of the FDA rule, comment letters to FDA on the rule, well, three. One, including the patient and consumer groups and the consumer union, the state attorneys general from 30 states, and from an attorney, Brandon Bogle.
Without objection, so ordered. That concludes the questions from the members who are present. We have another hearing going on. I'm sure other members will have questions. We'll send those to you in writing. We ask that you please respond promptly. I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to respond promptly. Members should submit their questions by the close of business on Tuesday, April 15. Thank you very much for your testimony today. It's been a very informative hearing, and without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.